In the quiet rural area of Pitcherstown, a deadly secret began to surface. Beneath the glossy exterior of neatly trimmed lawns and well-maintained homes, a tragic romance was brewing. At the center of it all was Mary Johnson, a 55-year-old housewife who outwardly led a comfortable life with her successful husband, John Johnson. However, within the walls of her elegant home, she wove a complex web of passion, deceit, and obsession. Mary had grown tired of her monotonous life. Her husband, always busy with his farm business, left her feeling invisible and unwanted. In search of excitement, she found herself entangled in relationships with 3 men, each offering her something special. Tom Smith, a 35-year-old mechanic with a rugged charm; Jake Brown, a 30-year-old veterinarian hired by John to care for the farm animals; and Chris Miller, a 25-year-old elementary school teacher who lived nearby. Mary Johnson was once the embodiment of grace and class, but now, at 55, her life was far from the glamorous picture it once was. She lived in a good home and in good comfort in one of Pitcherstown's neighborhoods, and she liked her surroundings. However, despite the outward perfection of her life, her family life had become quite dull. Mary had been married to John Johnson for over 30 years. John had always been the provider, building a successful farm that allowed them to live in luxury. But as the years passed, John became increasingly absorbed in his work. Their marriage, once full of excitement and passion, had turned into a love that began to fade with time. John was always away, either on the farm or returning late from work, and when he was home, he barely noticed Mary. Mary spent her days alone in the house. Her children had long since grown up and moved away, and the social circles she once frequented had become tiresome. She felt cut off from the world, from herself. The desire for excitement, for something to shatter the monotony of her life, grew with each passing day. Her outward appearance, however, remained impeccable. Mary took pride in maintaining her figure, youth, and sharp mind. People often commented on how she looked younger than her age, but beneath the surface, Mary was deeply lonely. She craved attachment, attention, and the feeling of being wanted again. Then came Tom Smith, the mechanic. At 35, he was much younger than Mary, but the way he looked at her, his lingering gazes, and compliments made her feel alive. It all started innocently enough with casual conversations at the door when he came to fix John's car, but soon they began meeting secretly. Tom was rough around the edges, but his mannerisms and confidence attracted Mary. Their first intimate encounter happened in the garage where Tom worked. Mary went there under the pretext of checking the car, and their conversation quickly turned into a passionate kiss. Tom pressed her against the wall, his hands exploring her body, and his lips eagerly seeking hers. Mary felt her heart race, and she gave in to the moment, enjoying every second. Next was Jake Brown, the veterinarian. John had hired Jake to help Mary care for the animals on the farm, and during their interactions, physical closeness and accidental touches sparked a flame between them. Jake was gentle and caring, his touches tender but insistent. Their first intimate encounter happened in the stable where Jake worked. Mary went there under the pretext of helping with the horses, and their conversation quickly turned into a passionate kiss. Jake pressed her against the stall, his arms wrapping around her waist, and his lips eagerly seeking hers. Mary felt her heart race, and she gave in to the moment, enjoying every second. And finally, there was Chris Miller, the elementary school teacher who lived nearby. Mary watched him with interest from afar, intrigued by his youthful energy. One day, when she asked him to help with yard work, their innocent interactions turned into something much more intimate. Chris was naive and idealistic, his touches gentle and caring. Their first intimate encounter happened in the garden where Chris worked. Mary went there under the pretext of helping with the flowers, and their conversation quickly turned into a passionate kiss. Mary found herself caught in a whirlwind of passion, torn between 3 men who were hopelessly in love with her. For the first time in many years, she felt truly alive, desired. However, deep down, Mary knew this couldn't last forever. The tension between the men was growing, and the intricate web she had woven was beginning to unravel. Mary gradually lost control of the situation. Tom became increasingly suspicious, and his jealousy began to consume him. He started showing up at Mary's house unannounced, sending her endless messages, demanding immediate responses. One day, after Mary canceled their meeting, Tom saw Jake's car parked outside her house. At that moment, something inside Tom snapped. In their next conversation, Tom flew into a rage, shouting and demanding explanations about Jake. Mary tried to remain calm and denied everything, but Tom didn't believe her. He accused her of using him and playing with his feelings. Jake, on the other hand, began to feel frustrated for different reasons. He had always believed that their relationship was more than just a fleeting affair. Jake was convinced that he and Mary had a future together, that she would leave John for him. But her indecision was wearing him down. In one of their conversations, Jake said, "Mary, what are we even doing? Is this just entertainment for you? I don't want to be your secret." Mary tried to reassure him, saying she needed time and that things weren't as simple as they seemed. But Jake wasn't satisfied. He wanted more from her. More time, more commitment, more than she could offer. And then there was Chris, sweet, naive Chris, who was head over heels in love with Mary. He was the easiest to manage but also the most vulnerable. Chris began to dream of a future together, even considering quitting his job to be with her full-time. Mary found his devotion touching, but she knew it couldn't last. Chris was too young, too idealistic, and he was in love with an image he had created, not the real Mary. She tried to distance herself from Chris, but the more she pulled away, the more insistent he became. He started showing up at her house unannounced, leaving flowers and love letters, standing at the door for hours hoping to see her. It was becoming overwhelming. The tension between the three men grew with each passing day, even though they were unaware of each other's existence. Mary, feeling the pressure from all sides, began to lose her grip. She knew this couldn't continue, and when everything collapsed, the consequences would be devastating. Her carefully crafted web of secrets was on the brink of collapse, and she felt it. The tension in her love life reached a boiling point, and it was only a matter of time before everything ended in catastrophe. The night everything changed started like any other. Mary planned to spend the evening alone, but Jake showed up unexpectedly with a bottle of wine and flowers. They sat at the table, chatting amiably, and before they knew it, they were on the floor in a passionate embrace. By a twist of fate, Tom decided that this night would be decisive in their relationship, and he arrived at her house drunk and enraged, determined to get answers and finally sort things out. Bursting into the house, he found Mary and Jake in an intimate setting. Mary and Jake were in the living room, their bodies entwined in a passionate embrace. Jake was gently stroking Mary's hair, his lips touching her neck, causing her to shiver with pleasure. Mary closed her eyes, savoring the moment, when suddenly the door burst open. Tom stormed into the room, his face contorted with anger, his eyes burning with jealousy. Mary and Jake jumped apart, their eyes wide with horror. Mary tried to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. Jake, feeling the need to protect Mary, stood in front of her, his body tensed, ready for a fight. Tom, unable to control himself, lunged at Jake. Fists flew, and soon the room was filled with the sounds of blows and screams. Mary, shocked and terrified, tried to intervene, but the men were beyond reason. They fought, their bodies locked in a deadly struggle. Chris, hearing the commotion and screams, rushed into the house. He entered the living room and saw the chaos. Tom and Jake were fighting, their faces twisted with rage, and Mary stood to the side, shocked and helpless. Chris tried to separate them, but his efforts were futile. In the chaos, someone grabbed a kitchen knife. It was unclear who made the first move, but in an instant, the scene turned deadly. The knife glinted under the dim kitchen light, and soon blood began to flow. Tom and Jake, both gravely wounded, collapsed to the floor. Mary, covered in blood, stood in shock, her perfect world shattered beyond repair. Chris, seeing the blood and the bodies on the floor, froze in horror. He tried to help, but it was too late. Two men lay dead, their lives cut short in an instant. Mary, shocked and devastated, couldn't believe what was happening. Her world had crumbled, and she stood at the center of the chaos, powerless to change anything. The quiet and peaceful corner of Pitcherstown was shaken to its core when police stormed into Mary Johnson's house and discovered the horrifying scene. Two lifeless bodies and pools of blood. News of the shocking discovery spread like wildfire through the community, and Mary's once perfect life became the object of public condemnation and gossip. Soon, experienced Detective Robert Anderson was assigned to the case. A man who had dealt with numerous crimes, but this one immediately gave him a strange, unsettling feeling. There was more to Mary Johnson than met the eye. Mary, stunned by the horrific events of the previous night, was taken to the police station for questioning. Her face was a frozen mask of horror, her hands trembling. She insisted that she never intended for things to end in such a nightmare, that she never wanted to harm anyone. But with each question from Detective Robert, the story of her complex relationships with the three men took on increasingly darker hues. This was not just a crime of passion. It was a complex web of passions, manipulations, and destruction. The investigation uncovered intimate details of her affairs that no one had suspected. Phone records, messages, and witness statements painted a portrait of a woman who played on the emotions of her lovers, driving them to the brink of madness. Tom Smith, the 35-year-old mechanic, was jealous to the point of obsession. He became increasingly intrusive, often showing up at Mary's door unannounced. Phone records showed dozens of missed calls and messages sent on that fateful night. Each of his actions reflected his growing obsession. Jake Brown, the 30-year-old veterinarian, was a different story. He deeply loved Mary and was convinced that she was his future life partner. Friends of Jake recounted how he increasingly talked about escaping the city, about a new life together with Mary, far away from all their problems. His dreams were shattered under the weight of her indecision. On that fateful night, Jake intended to have a final conversation with Mary. It was meant to be their ultimate reckoning. But the most vulnerable was Chris Miller, the young teacher who had just turned 25. His relationship with Mary was pure and innocent, though perhaps naive. He believed in the sincerity of her feelings and never suspected that Mary was playing a double or even triple game. That night, he found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, becoming an innocent victim of deception and false hopes. As the detectives pieced together the events of that terrible night, it became clear that Mary played a significant role in fueling the tension that ultimately led to the tragedy. Her manipulations, secrecy, and duplicity wove a cruel web from which there was no escape. But the central question remained unanswered. Who dealt the fatal blow? Who held the knife? Mary's statements were contradictory, and the evidence was inconclusive. Robert increasingly felt that behind her calm demeanor lay something far more sinister. Could it be that Mary was consciously manipulating the men, knowing that their emotions would one day flare up and everything would spiral out of control? As the trial against Mary Johnson approached, the atmosphere in the community grew increasingly tense. Newspapers splashed sensational headlines on their front pages, labeling her a femme fatale, a woman who lured men into a deadly trap. The prosecution confidently asserted that Mary skillfully manipulated her lovers, pushing them onto a path of jealousy and violence, without considering the consequences. They presented phone records, messages, and witness statements that laid out the events of that night in stark detail. The defense painted a different picture. Mary was portrayed as a lonely, lost woman who found herself at the center of a love drama she couldn't control. According to her lawyers, she never intended to harm anyone. Mary was trapped in her own helplessness, desperately trying to avoid the impending catastrophe, but all her efforts were in vain. The defense emphasized that Mary tried to break off the relationships, but the men, consumed by their obsessive fantasies, wouldn't let her go. When Mary took the stand, she appeared calm, but her eyes reflected despair. Her voice trembled as she spoke of her loneliness, of her need for attention and warmth, which she found in these relationships. "I never wanted things to go this far," she whispered. Her words seemed sincere, but the prosecution insisted that Mary deliberately played with her lover's emotions, enjoying their attention and not considering how it might end. The trial lasted several weeks. The jury listened intently to every word, trying to unravel the tangle of lies and half-truths. But when a new piece of evidence emerged, Mary's diary, hidden deep in her closet, the situation changed dramatically. The diary detailed her relationships with the men, their jealousy and passion. Most importantly, it showed that Mary was aware of the growing danger and did nothing to stop it. In one entry, she confessed that she enjoyed the attention. "They are all crazy about me," she wrote. "They think they can have me all to themselves, but they are wrong." The diary dispelled the last doubts. Mary was consciously playing with fire, knowing that it could end in tragedy. The jury, who had been divided, could no longer ignore the truth. Her guilt was evident. Mary had deliberately created the conditions for the catastrophe, and she had to answer for the consequences. The verdict was delivered. Mary was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Her manipulations and lies had led to the deaths of 2 men, and now she faced 20 years in prison, the minimum sentence due to the absence of prior convictions. As Mary Johnson was led out of the courthouse in handcuffs, a collective sigh of relief swept through the small town of Pitcherstown. It seemed that the scandal that had shaken the peaceful community to its core had finally come to an end, but the aftermath of the tragedy would linger in the hearts of the townspeople for a long time. Everyone understood that the shattered lives would never return to normal. John Johnson, Mary's husband, who had recently seen her as his devoted wife, was devastated. The revelation of her numerous infidelities broke him. He filed for divorce, unable to bear the weight of the memories of the life they once shared. The home they had built together now felt like a cold reminder of betrayal. John left Pitcherstown, leaving everything behind: the town, the memories, and his pain, in an attempt to start a new life, far away from that tormenting past. Chris Miller, the only one who survived the tragic love triangle, could not cope with the horror he had witnessed. He left his job at the school and also moved away from the town, haunted by memories of the woman who had captured his heart and the deaths of those he had considered his rivals. Every night, the images of the bloodied bodies of Tom and Jake flashed before his eyes, and he could find no peace. The dark past pursued him everywhere, reminding him that life would never be the same. Mary, whose passionate search for excitement and attention had destroyed everything around her, was left alone and lost. The lives of 3 young men, connected to her, were shattered, as was her own, which had once seemed so calm and perfect on the surface. Now, within the cold walls of her prison cell, Mary sat alone, reflecting on how her life had come to such an end. Ghostly thoughts gave her no rest. She reevaluated every choice, every word spoken, every gesture that had led to this unbearable tragedy. She had thought she could control the situation, that she could keep all the men at a distance, enjoying their admiration and attention. But the thirst for passion had been too strong. She had become entangled in playing with their emotions, not considering the consequences. Now, all she had left were the cold walls and memories of those moments when she still felt desired and alive. Each new day was a reminder of her fatal mistakes, from which there was no escape. The town of Pitcherstown, which had lived under the shadow of this scandal for so long, would never fully recover from the shock. Residents would whisper about it for years to come, in brief conversations on street corners, with a heavy heart. They would never forget the woman whose secrets and passions had turned their world upside down and destroyed the lives of so many people. Mary Johnson would remain for them not just a woman with a tragic fate, but a symbol of betrayal and ruin. Her name a painful reminder of how easily illusions can lead to irreversible consequences. Life in Pitcherstown slowly returned to its steady rhythm, but it felt as if an invisible shadow hung over the town. Even years later, this scandal would resurface in conversations around kitchen tables, like a curse the town could not shake off. Every new resident would learn the story while walking the streets where these events once took place. Old-timers would speak of it with caution, as a warning that should remind everyone of the fragility of human relationships and how passions can destroy what was once thought to be unshakable. Mary remained in prison, lost in her own thoughts. Her face, once full of lively interest and confidence, had grown pale and haggard over time. She had lost her former attractiveness, and even her character had changed, eroded by guilt and deep, all-consuming emptiness. Long hours of solitude left her too much time for reflection, and each morning was a painful repetition of nightly nightmares. Mary could no longer escape her thoughts, the pain, and the regret. She understood that her life had been ruined not only from the outside but also from within, by her own hands. Those rare letters she received from her former husband or acquaintances were cold, almost formal. No one believed in her innocence or that she was a victim of circumstances. Everyone saw her as a woman who had played a deadly game with the lives of others. All that remained was to accept this image, knowing that nothing could be changed. Years passed, but even within the prison walls, Mary could not find peace. The same shadows that haunted her lovers, whom she had so recklessly drawn into the deadly whirlpool of passions, haunted her. She often reflected on each of them. On Tom, whose jealousy had consumed him. On Jake, who had dreamed of a future with her but could not escape her shadow. And on Chris, the naive, lost boy whom she had hurt the most. Their faces haunted her, not allowing her to forget any of her mistakes. Sometimes she even thought she deserved her fate, and in those moments, a quiet resignation would wash over her. Perhaps this sentence was her punishment. Not just for those deadly events, but for her entire life, filled with selfishness and an insatiable desire to be the center of attention. But sometimes, in the dark hours of the night, when the silence became deafening, Mary could not help but wonder. What if she had made different choices? Could she have found true love? Could she have lived a life without lies, without pretense? These questions remained unanswered. Mary knew she would never have another chance to find the answers. Her life had been lost in a game she herself had started, and no amount of time could change that. She remained a prisoner of her memories, and in that lay her true tragedy. Neither the prison walls nor the years could free her from herself. Thus, the town of Pitcherstown continued to live, but the scars remained. With each passing year, the events of that tragic night gradually faded from the memories of new generations. But for those who had lived through those events, the pain remained fresh, as it had been on the day when Mary Johnson was led away in handcuffs, and the lives of 3 men had ended under the weight of her passions and manipulations.